Welcome to the Fade to White podcast. I'm your host, Jill Sim, and I will explore corners of American history, both known and unknown, as I uncover the secret history of my family who went from black to white and from enslavement to freedom as eyewitnesses to American history spanning over 200 years. In Season 1, we begin in the modern age, the discovery following my grandmother Ellen's death of my family's African-American history. The discovery of being the great-granddaughter of Anita Hemmings, considered the first black graduate of elite women's college, Vassar, and the discovery that my family passed for white throughout the 20th century. Please join me on this personal journey of discovery into American class, race, and gender history. And thank you for listening. My grandmother Ellen Parker Love was born to Anita Hemmings and Dr. Andrew Jackson Love in Boston, Massachusetts on December 7, 1905. Her first memories took place in Boston. She was born to the house of her grandparents, whom I had learned after Ellen's death were people of color. Ellen told me her earliest memory in life was scrabbling across the floor of the house, trailing after her older sister, golden-haired Dorothy Love, trying to catch up to her. Ellen remembered the nursery she and Dorothy shared, which overlooked an alleyway where neighborhood women hung their laundry on a spider's web of ropes. Ellen told me the skirts and shirtwaists they wore were tie-dyed. She told me that way before tie-dyed garments were associated with the 1960s counterculture or hippie aesthetic, turn-of-the-century working-class women tie-dyed clothing as a way to cover up grease spots. The women also wore the hippie scent patchouli, and the air around her grandparents' neighborhood was redolent with the woody, resinous fragrance. Grandma was reminded by this memory, which took place in 1907, when I came to visit her in the late 1980s, wearing a tie-dyed shirt and the oil. Patchouli was considered the mark of a low-class woman, Grandma warned, in an exaggerated, haughty tone, before giving me a sweet smile. Poking fun at Victorian conventions with which she was raised by her mother and father, yet never revealing that the neighborhood women who wore the tie-dye and patchouli were black. In 1907, Ellen's sister Dorothy died. Grandma was 2 years old. She remembered she looked for any traces of Dorothy through the house, unable to understand how her constant companion had up and vanished. Her next memory was that her parents moved from Boston to New York City. Grandma's doctor father, Andrew Jackson Love, a Harvard man Grandma always emphasized, was accepted to study surgery at New York's Columbia College of Physicians and Surgeons. Dr. Love took his grieving wife Anita, who was also carrying a third child, and surviving daughter Ellen to the train station. Grandma remembered standing on the platform, startled by the sights and sounds of the giant black locomotive, great curls of steam rising in anticipation of departure. The family prepared to board, but Ellen looked back. Her eyes found her grandparents, the only other family she knew. They were waving goodbye from the gate. She told me the image of her grandfather's drawn face stayed with her. Mere months later, the family returned to Boston to attend his funeral. "There were flowers as far as the eyes could see," she said, in a wistful tone. 3 months later, Ellen's sister Barbara was born premature. "I was the size of a grapefruit," Aunt Barbara remarked to me over the phone. She wasn't expected to survive. Dr. Love assisted during the delivery, and as soon as Sister Barbara entered the world, she was left on a sofa to die. Dr. Love heard the baby's lusty cries and realized there was fight in her. He ordered his exhausted wife, still mourning her Dorothy, Damn, Mrs. Love. Tend that baby. The Loves had moved into a sandstone brick townhouse at 521 West 142nd Street and Broadway, in the Morningside Heights section of the Upper West Side of Manhattan, a mile north of Columbia University. When not in class, Andrew maintained a general practice out of the home. Anita, a Vassar-educated gentlewoman, assisted her husband with the business while she looked after her little girls. Anita was fluent in 7 languages, and she helped Dr. Love translate articles culled from foreign medical journals. She was entrusted to fill simple prescriptions for patients when Andrew was at school, and she forged her husband's signature. A sympathetic neighborhood pharmacist, Wallace G. Geedy, knew the family didn't have a support system in town, and he turned a blind eye to help the Loves as they were starting out. Dr. Love spent his residency at one of the city hospitals. Grandma said her father worked at the privately funded upscale French hospital. In his absence, a succession of mademoiselles was hired to help with the children. Anita wanted a person of irreproachable character to teach the children French and manners while providing basic needs. Anita was not much of a cook when she married. According to Grandma, her mother had prepared for her marriage by taking a course at the Fannie Farmer Cooking School in Boston, where she concentrated solely on the baking courses. She learned to make elaborate, complicated cakes, but struggled at the practical matter of maintaining a larder and organizing weekly menus as she was expected to do. But Anita was not much interested in housewifery. And one by one, those mademoiselles quit. Grandma confessed the 2 little Love girls were a handful, especially tiny Barbara, who teased and pinched and possessed a mean streak her older sister lacked. Despite having underdeveloped lungs from birth, Barbara had inexhaustible energy, and she wore out every single one of her minders. Dr. Love would bundle Barbara up and have her stand on the rooftop, breathing in winter air to work her lungs, and to give the weary Love family a break. Despite being little hellions, Anita made certain the Love girls were always groomed and smartly turned out. Ellen loved the cotton batiste peignoir that matched her nightgown, and dimity and dotted Swiss dresses, and soft kid leather boots that buttoned up the side. She remembered her beaver and horsehair hats, and described how Anita tried in vain to wrap Ellen's thin, straight hair with cotton rags to produce those enviable, glossy, springy banana curls the other girls' mamas managed to arrange so perfectly. The Loves filled the home with beautiful, ornate furniture. There was a velvet settee and a circular sofa with a high back positioned in the foyer, which Grandma overturned as a prank so that it looked like a giant red velvet mushroom to sick and scowling patients. There was the family's mahogany lowboy I knew growing up, with its brass pulls on brass plates shaped like bats and faint acanthus leaf carvings on cabriole legs. The only piece of furniture, Grandma said, that went all the way back to the beginning, to Virginia, surviving a fire early on when all other furniture burned, surviving by being left behind and not loaded onto an ill-fated ship which sank, surviving many family moves, divorces, and robberies. In the 19-teens, Grandma remembered being taken by her doctor father on horseback up Broadway, a dirt road at the time, all the way to Inwood Hill in northern Manhattan, where representatives of a dwindling band of the Lenape culture still lived on their ancestral lands. They claimed descent from the people who had sold Manhattan Island to the Dutch West India Company for a handful of beads in the 17th century. In the teens and 1920s, the Lenape sold trinkets and gave tours of their caves in Inwood Park, and they sang and danced, holding on to customs following centuries of marginalization. Dr. Love treated this band, and father and daughter were eyewitnesses to their disappearing folkways before the construction of a highway, another inevitable modern urban improvement, which cleared the Inwood Hill Park Lenape from the caves and hunting and fishing grounds forever. Dr. Love's weekend work was personal, Grandma said, because he was of Native ancestry. He was part Cherokee, Chickasaw, or Choctaw. Grandma couldn't remember which one. Dr. Love retired the hired horse for the family's first automobile in 1910, and the family took a harrowing trip down the paved southern section of Broadway. Grandma remembered hurtling down the avenue, dray horses veering away from the vibrating, rattling, loud, smoking machine as the family were magically transported downtown, racing into the modern age in the most conspicuous symbol in the American story of upward mobility. My dad told me he heard Dr. Love resented when traffic lights were installed around Grand Central Station, and he tended to ignore red lights if the coast was clear, revealing a surprising rebellious streak. Younger brother Andy was added to the fold in 1911 when Anita was almost 40 years old and Dr. Love 50. The Love children studied music. Barbara and Ellen were encouraged to play the violin, the most difficult instrument to master, and another signifier of the family's aspirations into upper-middle-class ranks. Ellen practiced with a cute blonde neighborhood boy named Dick. Barbara told me Dick used to carry his bow around everywhere with him, advertising his devotion to practice, while he would jab little Barbara in the ribs with it whenever he encountered her, which made her blush and bristle 80 years after the fact. Barbara said Grandma was much better than she and Dick were on violin, making first chair at their private school, Horace Mann. Barbara said when practice sessions did not go well, Ellen would refer to their trio as the, quote, scratchboard association of toilet workers, her way of saying they sounded shitty. Music's allure surpassed perfunctory practice sessions for brother Andy. Andy Love was a born musical genius, and he spent all of his free time learning multiple instruments and arranging popular songs for pals and himself to sing on the streets of New York. Band music and jazz, the distinctly Black American invention, seized Andy and wouldn't let go. Anita worried about her son's future prospects, and she begged the powers at Mount Hermon, a boarding school in Massachusetts, to admit Andy, to rescue him from popular music. Mount Hermon School for Boys and its female counterpart, Northfield, where Anita had prepared for Vassar College, offered prep to ambitious students of modest means. As Anita wrote the Mount Hermon dean, Henry Cutler, quote, "We must send Andrew away from the city to rid him of his friends. All good boys, but they keep him from studying. He is very fond of music, and he and his friends are singing when they should be studying." Close quote. As proof that teenage Andy Love fit the Mount Hermon standard, Anita sent Dean Cutler a faded note from one of Andy's elementary school teachers, which stated that little Andy had an IQ of 130. Mount Hermon understandably wanted a more recent record of achievement and requested one from Andy's current school, Friends Seminary. In his reply to Cutler, seminary principal Henry Lee Messner echoed Anita's concern that Andy was, quote, easily led by other boys, close quote, but he added that Andy was also, quote, pampered by a fond mother, close quote. He required, quote, firm handling as to his habits and attitude, close quote, towards work. Cutler expressed his own reservations about Andy, especially as he would start term late, but Andy was accepted provisionally. Though amiable and agreeable, and I remember very well Uncle Andy was sweet, warm, generous of spirit, Andy was described as, quote, careless by the Mount Hermon head. He was badly disorganized and distracted, not the self-disciplined scholar his mother wanted. There's something, too, to Messner's belief that Anita spoiled Andy. She didn't treat him with anything resembling firmness, as she herself revealed, quote, I think Andy will improve in weight if he can enter Mount Hermon, where he will have his meals regularly and have to be in bed at a certain time. This is hard to regulate here. He does not always get his lunch with his lunch money. One year he saved it to buy a telescope, close quote. Andy was placed on academic probation after Christmas break. Anita wrote a letter requesting the school allow Andy to travel to Boston over a weekend to see Sister Ellen perform in a play. The administration advised against travel, given the record to date. They must have been exasperated with Anita's request, in light of the rapidly deteriorating academic performance, Andy's lack of initiative, lengthy absences due to frequent illness, especially after bending the rules to admit him. Andy flunked almost every subject in spring term. He was refused admittance to Mount Hermon for the following school year. His expulsion from Mount Hermon was distressing. Anita excelled at the sister school, boasting in her note that she was the first girl at elite Vassar College to be given a scholarship covering freshman year, owing to her perfect record at Northfield. But any hereditary argument she could make on Andy's behalf would not have reversed the decision. A second boarding school was found. Andy was safe from the seductive city streets again, but Anita's aim to make a scholar out of her son and to keep him isolated from dreaded band music and the punks who played it failed spectacularly. As noted on the back of one of Andy's publicity photos once he became a professional musician, Andy Love originally joined up with the singers in his band at boarding school. The girls abandoned their violin practice to dance. Grandma studied for years under Ted Papa Shawn, who, along with his wife Ruth St. Dennis, created the world-famous modern dance studio Dennis Shawn. At Dennis Shawn, students learned movement and gesture from faraway places and times, popular Orientalism of Asia, and Grecian, Roma, and North African and Egyptian-inspired movements. They danced outside in nature, and the loose shapes they formed in the aftermath of World War I were sensual and individualistic expressions against conservative ballroom and social dancing. The dancers rejected foxtrot, cakewalk, and waltz forms. They rejected male dance partners as prospective beaux. Modern dancing was a shocking expression of 20s feminism, and my grandmother embraced what that represented and awakened in her. I don't know if she was aware or not that Dennis Shawn had a policy of placing a cap on the numbers of Jewish students allowed, and admitted one black student, Edna Guy, who also had to work for Ruth St. Dennis as her assistant and seamstress, and wasn't allowed to perform with the all-white touring company. Popular silent film actresses, the Gish sisters, studied at Dennis Shawn. Sister Lillian played the leading female role in the silent film epic celebrating the Ku Klux Klan, Birth of a Nation. One of my grandmother's classmates at Dennis Shawn was Martha Graham, who would become the iconic figure in modern dance. Grandma admired the passionate and hardworking Graham and their peer, future Broadway choreographer Doris Humphrey, with whom Grandma would work when she turned to professional stage acting. But Grandma, who never said unkind things about other people, loathed their other classmate who would become world famous as a film star, the uber flapper Louise Brooks. With a contemptuous curl of her lip, Grandma said of Brooksy, "Oh, she was a very fast bitch." Perhaps the one time I heard her swear, and visibly aggrieved 60 years after the final encounter. Brooksy's memory of my grandmother in her evocative memoir, Lulu in Hollywood, dripped with her signature disdain for other mere mortals. Quote, "The only sweat-free, stink-free pupil was also the only New York pupil, a sweet, lonely fat girl, stood around waiting for one of the 3 boys in the class to ask her out, which none of them ever did." Close quote. No love lost there. Ellen's figure was unfashionable. When women were binding their breasts and using cocaine and cigarettes and reducing diets to achieve the desirable boyish slender figure that was ideal. Broad and tall Ellen would have been deemed fat by the standards of the day, and by Brooksy's own cocaine-fueled standards. Ellen worshipped English dancer Isadora Duncan most of all. Duncan's fluid movements and flowing, diaphanous chiffon liberated women from societal constraints, literally from Mother Anita's corsets, and from stiff and prim movements taught at the popular dancing schools Anita insisted all her children and grandchildren attend, whose purpose was not exercise, but to prepare pupils for moving about gracefully in high society. Duncan's dance of liberation aroused such yearning and desperation in Ellen that she and Barbara, in little sister copycat mode, begged Anita and Andrew to let them go to Europe to live as one of Duncan's children. This was after Isadora Duncan lost her own children in Paris to a drowning in the Seine River. Duncan appealed to parents worldwide to give up their children to her so that she could raise them and train them to dance, to release them from the prison of conformity and to be set free by a bohemian existence. Andrew and Anita refused to release their daughters to the faraway foster care of Isadora Duncan, and Barbara recalled she and Ellen cried about losing the chance to grow up in Europe for weeks. Grandma revealed to me that as a child, she had wished many times for different parents. But the stick-in-the-mud loves were justified in this one instance anyway. Elsa Lanchester, the bride of Frankenstein of the movie classic, did live as one of Duncan's adopted children, and she resented being forced to kiss Duncan's hand and be on daily display for rich and famous strangers, constantly parading through Duncan's home and dance studio. Grandma told me the family found themselves unified, however, in collective fascination and disgust over the sensational breaking news story of the times, involving the divorced middle-aged millionaire Edward Daddy Browning and some young girls he rescued from their impoverished circumstances. The girls were portrayed in the newspapers as Browning's Cinderellas, given fairy tale endings according to Daddy Browning. The most infamous among the girls was Frances Peaches Heenan, 15, whom the 51-year-old Daddy Browning rescued by marrying just 38 days after meeting Peaches at a teen dance. The question as to why Daddy Browning was at a teen dance in the first place was never answered in the daily reports. But Grandma remembered she and her parents obsessively tracked the coverage of this May-December catastrophe over their egg breakfasts. They shook their heads over the incident of the acid attack, the poisoning of the young model, the unsavory revelations about the domestic arrangements, and the honking pet goose who lived in Peaches and Daddy's bedroom. The Loves agreed that post-war American society had become so permissive, debased, and backwards, it normalized pedophilia and transactional sexual relationships between old men and little girls. Arrangements that existed in the past, but should have disappeared with women's liberation of the 1920s. In the late 1920s, the Loves quit Morningside Heights and moved further south and west to a newly built luxury high-rise at 180 Riverside Drive on 90th Street. The Loves were moving up in the world. The building was a red and white brick jewel in a landscape increasingly studded with luxury high-rise apartment buildings. The building employed uniformed doormen who worked around the clock as security, working doors, receiving packages, processing guests, and operating passenger and service elevators off a long and grand marble-tiled lobby with gleaming checkerboard marble flooring. Units on upper floors offered unobstructed views of the city's skyline in rapid development, the Hudson River, and a bucolic countryside across the river around Bergen, New Jersey. The building's west facade overlooks Central Park's eternally inferior counterpart Riverside, and the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, a white Grecian temple to the Union men who fought in the Civil War. Grandma spent her youth on Riverside Drive, just 7 blocks from where I would spend much of mine, at 83rd Street and West End Avenue. She and I ranged the same territory a half-century apart. She knew the neighborhood transforming from former farmland to upper-middle-class enclave. I knew it as often dangerous ground during 1970s and 1980s decay. I compared the city I knew to hers. When my former stepfather, historian Richard F. Snow, was serving as the editor of American Heritage magazine, he recalled what the writer F. Scott Fitzgerald said of New York back then. Quote, "It was the best time and place to be alive in since the world began, and everybody knew it. I remember riding in a taxi one afternoon between very tall buildings under a mauve and rosy sky. I began to bawl because I had everything I wanted and knew I would never be so happy again." Close quote. This town my grandmother grew up in was described as, quote, "supreme," close quote. The New York City of my youth was not supreme. My elementary school was a brutalist brick building on 84th Street between Columbus and Amsterdam Avenues, and stood across the street from prison-like Brandeis High, where ambulances showed up every day. Before it was blessed with two ugly schools during the 1960s, the street gained notoriety for its squalid tenements and hyperviolence, and was dubbed in newspapers as the, quote, worst block in New York, close quote. The streets I used to walk to school reeked of urine and char from apartment fires and were minefields of broken glass and dog shit. Our apartment in a fading pre-war building, another pre-war glory at the time it was built, was robbed of anything remotely valuable twice. And both times by our secretly entrepreneurial building superintendent who was running a heroin startup out of the basement. I often slept with a knife under my pillow after too many run-ins with flashers and muggers, and then the robberies. In Riverside Park, my older brother Jeff and I and other feral latchkey kids would climb the graffiti-tagged Soldiers and Sailors Monument under the glare of the building the Loves had lived in when it was brand new, when the Loves had fully crossed the color line into the white world. Their beautiful building had seen better days by my time, too. But living in the city has always been a trade-off. F. Scott Fitzgerald's and Grandma's posher world was deeply segregated and extremely classist. In my time, the city was a truer melting pot and operated as more egalitarian, geared, if imperfectly, towards the greatest happiness of the greatest number, and attempted to animate an open society that a majority of the people could experience. It was a time when A-list stars stood on the same long lines for movie theaters and for bagels with a schmear, time of pay-as-you-wish museums, I usually paid a nickel, and revival movie theaters where you could see 2 features for $1, and cheap Chinese lunch deals, and 75-cent pizza slices, bodegas for emergency needs and excellent snacks, used bookstores, so many of them, and Indian and vintage clothing boutiques, all of which became the places of refuge during the after-school hours. When I wasn't in ballet class, I used to hide from predatory older men who liked to show me their penises, and from school toughs who looked to jump me as I walked home, and from roving bands of muggers who relieved me of my spare change and both my brother and I of our bicycles. I didn't know which version of New York was better. Maybe both, maybe neither one. But for a long time, I assumed Ellen's New York was preferable. She attended safe private schools with teachers who cared about her development and weren't burnt out and apathetic. Her street was insulated from crime and urban blight, and she was also able to fully escape the city for months at a time during the long, humid summers, because a white middle-class family could afford sleepaway camp back then. The Love girls left our sweltering, smutty, miasmic town for camp and settings the Loves believed would improve health and build character. Summer extensions of private school for the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant children. Andrew and Anita found a sailing camp at the elbow of the Cape Cod Peninsula in Massachusetts. Camp Quonset on sparkling Pleasant Bay. The camp attracted beautifully turned out and impeccably mannered young ladies from up and down the eastern seaboard who raced the bracing blue Atlantic waters in baybird sloops and mastered Red Cross lifeguarding and swimming skills. The wealthiest girls boarded horses for the 2-month session. In comfortable airy cabins, rain or shine, the girls gossiped and composed doggerel and skits and swapped fashion in popular culture magazines. They learned all the idiosyncratic songs that cemented their sisterhood and compelled their returns to Quonset year after year. My grandmother spent at least 3 summers there. She described for me the cotton gloves the girls wore on hot day outings to Provincetown at the tip of the Cape, and the white leather shoes which pinched swollen summer feet. She remembered her billowy camp bloomers, a precursor to shorts. They were uncomfortable, and she had to wear woolen half-stockings with them, and she constantly worried about soiling the white fabric. Bathing costumes were also made of wool, a similar fabric as Grandma's Denichon leotard, and stank of mildew after weeks of wearing never completely drying out from excessive use. Aunt Barbara confessed that the Quonset girls were not always perfectly behaved. They used to sneak away in the dead of night, steal skiffs they would then row to the all-boys camp, located in a neighboring cove off Little Pleasant Bay, and try to engineer some interlude. Grandma admitted that, like me, she started smoking very young and snuck cigarettes. At the end of summer session, the girls performed in a final spectacle, playing Native Americans in the Camp Quonset Indian pageant. New England sleepaway camps were often given faux Native names, part of a tradition in Manifest Destiny's aftermath and the so-called winning of the West, romanticizing and bastardizing cultures of the vanquished, and marking the acquisition of indigenous geographies as trophies of a triumphant superior white civilization. Sleepaway camp allowed the white children to go native. They wore feathers and beads, sang Indian songs, traded wampum, whittled tomahawks, and shot bows and arrows. Grandma Ellen, taller and broader than her peers, performed as the lead warrior brave in the annual pageant at the end of season. She would also go on to play another Native American warrior while attending Vassar. Her performance, she insisted, was more authentic than other girls because she was channeling her dad's heritage, which came courtesy a Cherokee or Chickasaw or Choctaw princess. She couldn't remember which. And she added that on her mother's side, we descended from Pocahontas, America's first Indian princess from 17th century Virginia. She seemed to have mixed feelings about the sailing camp. I'm not sure why. When camp was over, Dr. and Mrs. Love drove to the Cape from the city. Bringing Andy along, they picked up the girls and then took the ferry across Nantucket Sound to the island of Martha's Vineyard. Grandma said she and Barbara and Andy Jr. would spend the remaining days of summer exploring, strolling Circuit Avenue and Oak Bluffs, looking for saltwater taffy and ice cream cones, catching rides on the Flying Horses Carousel, and boarding the island train venturing out to the sunset-hued Aquina Cliffs. They swam with little turtles in the blue-green waters of oval-shaped Lake Anthony. Dr. Love would take his beautiful wife, Anita, and 3 smartly turned-out children to restaurants for cold, briny oysters, and they would sit on benches in manicured parks during the late afternoons and admire the passing summer crowds, admiring them. Aunt Barbara remembered that growing up, Dr. Love was distant with Ellen and she with him. She said Ellen never took her father's hand, never cuddled with him. When they traveled from Woods Hole to the vineyard on the ferry, Ellen would never sit with the family. She would sit far from them, up front, nose stubbornly in a book. Ellen told me she and her father didn't see eye to eye on most things. She told me she detested eggs, hated them, while her father, a physician in the early part of the century, believed that eating eggs daily was key to a strong constitution. And he forced eggs on his terrorized family every single day. One morning, my grandmother had it, and she rebelled. She left for school on an empty stomach. Several hours later, sitting in a classroom, Ellen suddenly spotted her mother's wan face in the door window. The teacher opened the door, and the kids turned to see Mrs. Love holding a plate with a napkin draped over it. Anita's eyes teared as she explained to the teacher that Ellen must come and eat her breakfast, a decree from the father. Dr. Love sent his wife on the errand to ensure his orders were followed to the letter. She didn't want to do it, but she had to obey her husband. Mortified, Ellen was excused to her mother, and then she had to stand in the hall and choke down those now cold, slimy eggs. She had to finish the disgusting breakfast in front of staring, sneering, snickering snoots. Aunt Barbara also recalled how during her pregnancy with brother Andy, Dr. Love had imposed an all-beet diet on Anita to enrich her blood. Aunt Barbara chuckled meanly as she remembered how her parents went out to a steak restaurant with friends, and Dr. Love ordered Anita only the requisite plate of beets, depriving her of succulent grilled steak. The daughter's reports of a domineering and restrictive father were pretty incriminating. His tyranny emboldened by a submissive wife, and with both parents coddling their all-important son and Grandma being expected to constantly monitor impossible Barbara. It was understandable, even if Grandma got the private schools and Camp Quonset and Martha's Vineyard summers, why she wished for other parents and isolated herself from them. Grandma didn't like to recall her childhood, which was lonely overall. She remembered some lively tea dances on hotel rooftops, but she had few friends, and then parents who didn't understand her. Ellen practiced her music and dancing and disappeared into plays and novels, but her social circle was limited to one or two girls, and to the tiny tag-along sister. Barbara told me they weren't allowed to have friends over to the apartment, which made socializing difficult. In the afternoons, after school, Ellen played Debussy's Clair de Lune over and over again on the family's Victrola, yearning for her soulmate, the silent screen star Rudolph Valentino. During the period, Anita captioned a photograph of her teenage daughter, Eleonora Duzza, after the renowned Italian actress, famous for being one of the great tragedians of all time, because she thought her daughter was being overly dramatic. Ellen said Anita did not approve of motion pictures. They were for the common people. She went too far with me in saying her mother would have disapproved of my worship of movie star Marilyn Monroe. Teenager me wondered, why should I care what Anita thought? She didn't know me. I didn't know her. I remained ever loyal to my Marilyn. And I wondered what side of the family produced my delightful grandma and her warm and funny music maker brother Andy, and even the kooky fantasist sister Barbara, because none of them seemed to come from Dr. and Mrs. Love, based on all reports. Anita and I wouldn't have gotten along. I mean, she loved opera, with all the histrionic singing and artifice, and I was sure she was beyond tickled with herself that she could understand every language the famous works were written in, French, Italian, German, to inspire an even deeper appreciation of the high art form. The only good thing about opera for me was people watching, which you couldn't do when the lights were dimmed. I was your crass and vulgar movie fan, affordable art for the commoners. And I sympathized with my grandmother in her youth during New York City's supreme jazz age because it sounded dreary and lonesome and confining. The stodgy Loves were probably utter crap on summer vacations, too. And I so sympathized with Ellen's love for hot and exciting Valentino, whom Anita dismissed as an Italian stud. In my own youth, I was in love with Cary Grant, and knowing I was born too late to ever be with him broke my heart. I played Tears for Fears, Everybody Wants to Rule the World over and over again on the stereo in the same pining and dramatic manner as my grandmother. Anita preferred Grandma's real-life boyfriend, cute blonde neighbor Dick. Now, Dick was from a good family, and he was a prodigy. He was accepted to Columbia University when he was just 15. Grandma recalled Dr. and Mrs. Love were both fond of her beau, and Dick was the only one of very few their age who were invited inside the Love apartment. Barbara recalled Dick used to come over every day, all the time. He never knocked. He was free to come and go as he pleased. But during the summer of 1923, after the annual trip to Martha's Vineyard, and as Grandma was preparing to enter Vassar College's class of 1927, she and Dick had an awful fight, and they ended their romance. I have a photograph of Dick in two pieces. Ellen tore his face in two in the aftermath of this fight. Barbara told me the last time she saw Ellen, before Ellen died, Ellen said Dick had wanted to marry her. Barbara never knew that. Barbara related over the phone, Dick gave Ellen a ring, which she still has. I saw that she had it with her the last day I saw her. It was an heirloom in his family and meant to be an engagement ring. Ellen started wearing it, and Dad saw it and said, "And what is that?" And Ellen said, "Dickie gave it to me." And my father said, "Well, you better give it right back to him and tell him to come and see me." So when Dick came over, my father told him, "Ellen is going to college, so we'll have none of that serious business going around here. She will not marry until she gets an education." Barbara said that she eavesdropped on the lovers' final quarrel, observing their breakup from an unseen point in the lobby. During the scene, Barbara said Dick and Ellen tossed Dick's ring back and forth several times until Dick lobbed the ring one last time and it landed on a lobby tile. It remained there. Ellen refused to pick it up, and she stomped upstairs. But Barbara snatched it for safekeeping, and she held on to it, and then returned it to Ellen once her temper had cooled. I don't know what happened to that ring. Grandma told me the cause of the breakup was that after she returned to the city from Martha's Vineyard, while she was preparing to leave, Dick wanted her to promise him something. He wanted her to be faithful and not see other guys when she was at college. She couldn't promise him she would not. But I think, given the timing, summer 1923, just after the family trip, and from what I would learn later, that the promise she could not keep to this boy from a good white family was about something else entirely.